Welcome everyone to Carlingford Prezi Church this morning. It's great to see you all here. We're going to be continuing our talks on Haggai this week, and Bruce is going to be talking to us a bit later. At home I've got two drawers dedicated to my t-shirts. One for nice clean ones like this one, and the other for clean but unclean shirts. I've affectionately named these shirts the dirty work shirts, but unfortunately they always seem to be multiplying. As the clean drawer empties, the dirty work drawer fills, and so I am a bit of a grub. I have a bad habit of getting tough stains on things that no amount of nappy sand can get out. And so I use these shirts for things like exercise, for mowing, working in the garden, working on the car. Every once in a while, I'll go through these shirts and demote some even further to the rags bag, where they are doomed to eventually be chucked out. My bad habit of getting stains on things means I know that most of my clean shirts will inevitably join their roommates one day in the dirty work or the rags bag sooner or later. But this is what we do today, isn't it? When something is broken, old, or dirty, it is doomed to be chucked out. And that's what God is saying about all people here in Haggai 2. We're stained, we're defiled by sin. We have a bad habit of getting sin on ourselves which we cannot get off. And God really should just throw us in the dirty work drawer as a lost cause, or the rags bag where we're doomed to be chucked out. But he has other plans, which Bruce is going to talk to us a little bit later from Haggai 2. But we're going to read this now, and Barbara is going to come up and read for us.
On the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet. Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask the priests about the law. If someone carries holy meat in the fold of his garment and touches with his fold bread or stew or wine or oil or any kind of food, does it become holy? The priests answered and said, no. Then Haggai said, if someone who is unclean by contact with a dead body touches any of these, does it become clean? Unclean? The priests answered and said, it does become unclean. Then Haggai answered and said, so it is with this people and with this nation before me, declares the Lord, and so with every work of their hands. And what they offer there is unclean. Now then, consider this day onward. Before stone was placed upon stone in the temple of the Lord, how did you fare? When one came to a heap of 20 measures, there were but 10. When one came to the wine vat to draw 50 measures, there were but 20. I struck you and all the products of your toil with blight and with mildew and with hail, yet you did not turn to me, declares the Lord. Consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month. Since the day that the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider, is the seed yet in the barn? Indeed, the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree have yielded nothing. But from this day on, I will bless you. The word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month. Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth, and to overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of nations, and overthrow the chariots and their riders. And the horses and their riders shall go down, every one by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts.
I'll just pray again briefly. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to meet this morning and look at your word. Thank you for Jesus, who unites us with you. Thank you that through him we can have a personal relationship with you. Amen. For my occupation, I often travel long distances to manufacturing plants that make all sorts of food and pharmaceutical products. When I roll up to a plant to solve a problem, sometimes it involves an awfully long drive. After that awfully long drive, you'd think that the customer would be glad to see me. What took you so long? We wanted you here yesterday is often the welcome on arrival. The machinery is not usually working properly, and sometimes it's not working at all, which is holding up production. And at the end of the day, it's all about profit. Breakdowns cost the plant money. And as I'm a representative of my company and its corporate logos plastered all over the machinery, just like it's plastered all over the ute that I drive and my uniform, I'm personally responsible, or so they think. And it's like I own the piece of equipment and I caused it to malfunction, which is pretty far from the truth. The reality is that they own the machine and I didn't cause it to break down. And I don't lay awake at night hoping that stuff breaks down. It's quite the opposite. Shortly after my arrival on site, typically I'll have to sign in at security and then do all the necessary paperwork, inductions and work permits, and then it's off to the plant proper. And I have to put on my PPE, that's personal protective equipment. And I have to sanitise. Sanitising involves much hand washing and sanitiser. And this was standard procedure even before COVID. And once I put on my PPE, it involves putting on gloves, a hairnet, a beard net, a face mask, a gown or a pair of overalls, and then I'm ready to go. The plants are messy places, especially food-producing plants. And you may think how nice of them it is to provide me with all this gear to wear to protect me from getting dirty. But it's not really the case. They then asked me to remove my boots and hand me a pair of rubber gum boots to wear in the plant. And these boots have been scrubbed clean and dipped in chemical solutions capable of killing all kinds of microbiological life instantly and rendering the surface completely sterile and germ-free on the outside of the boot. However, looking into the inside of those boots is like looking into a wombat hole. You don't know what's lurking down there. And I stare into the boots, looking into the forbidding twin caverns of unknown, often stained grey and falling apart with the webbing peeling off and the inner sole damp and mushy. The inside of the boots is a completely different scenario to the outside. You see, within these boots, which have been worn by all mankind and I'm sure by a few other bipeds before me, lurk all the known and unknown bacterial and fungal foot rot infections that you could possibly imagine. The reality is the plant doesn't care about me. My PPE is not really personal protective equipment, it is plant protective equipment. And I'm considered unclean and a potential source of contamination. I could compromise their production should some part of my person come in physical contact with the production process. Asking me to put on a pair of sterile on the outside, manky on the inside boots doesn't matter because in their eyes I'm unclean like the inside of the boots. We're a good match. And so all the filthy bits are contained within the cocoon of my PPE, and only then am I considered clean enough, on the outside at least, to venture into the plant. It seems there's a problem with the people of Judah who've returned from exile. Haggai uses the analogy in 2:12 to 14 of the consecrated offering that's covered, if the covering of the consecrated offering comes in contact with an item that's not consecrated, does that make that item clean? No, it does not. Like if I walk into a plant and the outside of my clean PPE garments come in contact with the food being made in there, in that germ-free environment, do I become germ-free? No, I do not. Underneath all that protective clothing, I'm considered contaminated. Likewise, if I remove my boot and stick my big toe into a vat of freshly made liquid suitable for human consumption, do I become clean? No, I do not. In fact, I would render the entire batch unfit for market and it would have to be destroyed. It doesn't matter if I put on a clean uniform that morning or how much washing I've done on my hands. As far as the plant manager is concerned, I'm defiled and not fit to come in contact with anything in the plant. Haggai is saying that the people of Israel are defiled because of their sin. And Haggai 2:14 reads, "Then Haggai said, 'So it is with this people of this nation in my sight, declares the Lord. Whatever they do and whatever they offer there is defiled.'" Haggai is not specific about the sins of Israel, but if you read the books written about the same time period like Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, or even cast your mind back to the Malachi series, which we did earlier in the year, which is a bit later, you get an idea that their hearts are not in the life of the temple or the worship of God. Now, you may be saying to yourself, not another sermon on sin, and I'm sick of feeling wretched and put down. But that's not my intention, and I'm sorry if my talk takes you places that you'd rather not go. But our sin is no greater or lesser than the person we're sitting next to or the person out in the street. So we're all equal in God's eyes when we sin. We all do it. Some people play down their sin and think comparatively they're sinners of no consequence. Perhaps they've not considered that a holy God cannot tolerate any sin. And the thing that separates mankind from God is sin. So we're all equal in that department. I think when we're honest with ourselves and examine our past, there are dark parts of our personal history that we'd rather forget and certainly don't want to talk about. And I've been reading a biography of Paul Kelly by Stuart Coupe. It's a biography that Paul Kelly has endorsed, and I'm a great fan of Paul. He's perhaps Australia's greatest contemporary songwriter and has been for the past 40 years, but he hates his early work. He's withdrawn his first two albums, Talk and Manila, from the market. You can't buy them or listen to them on Spotify or stream them. Most people like these albums. I do, and so does my wife Hazel. We were listening to Talk the other night, and Hazel actually managed to dance around the kitchen, which she doesn't often do. It still holds up today, in my opinion, but Paul Kelly hates his first two albums. The people closest to him speculate that these recordings remind him of an earlier period of his life that he'd rather forget, when his first marriage and personal relationships were in disarray and he used a lot of heroin. I don't know about you, but there are early periods of my life that I just want to forget, and I want to destroy any shred of evidence or blot out the bad memories due to the things that I've done wrong. I just want to wipe the tape clean. I don't know, maybe it's just me. I wonder if Donald Trump feels that way. When we sin against individuals, we also sin against God. And if every sin is a sin against God, then God has sinned against more than anyone. The people we sin against may or may not forgive us. But God has the capacity to cleanse us and forgive us. And if we genuinely ask for mercy. Recently we had a really good talk on Psalm 15. where David asks God for mercy and forgiveness when his sins are exposed. Perhaps David realises that his sin against God is great when he says, "Against you alone I have sinned." In reality, he sinned against his friends, his people, and his army. They may or may not have forgiven him, but David realises that it's God alone who can save him. And so he turned to God for forgiveness. This was probably the model David wanted all God's people to follow. But often it's not until a prophet like Haggai comes along that Israel actually listened, repented, and turned to God. And now that Israel have laid the foundations of the second temple, they're on track. They've listened to what Haggai has said, and they've turned to God. In the section Haggai 2:15-18, we learn how Israel suffered when they did not turn to God. They would go to the grain store for 20 measures and find only 10, or the wine cellar for 50 measures of wine and only find 20. There was not enough to go around. In the past, their harvests were poor due to their sin. The work of their hands was struck down with blight, mildew, and hail. But now, regardless of their sin, God says he will bless them. Haggai 2:19 reads, "Is there any sin left in the barn? Until now, the vine and the fig tree, the pomegranate and the olive have not borne fruit. From this day on, I will bless you." In the past, prior to exile, Israel, God's people, enjoyed God's presence dwelling among them in the tabernacle or the permanent temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. But it was not like the Garden of Eden, where God walked with his people daily. In the Garden of Eden, there was a more personal relationship between God and man prior to the fall. After Exodus, when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, they camped out in the wilderness. The tabernacle would be set up in the centre of the camp. They could look at the tabernacle and see God's presence from a distance in the form of a cloud by day and a fire by night. And when the cloud moved, they'd follow the cloud till it stopped. And then they'd set up camp again. But they could not go inside the temple. The temple was a reminder of how difficult it is to approach God in a state of sin. The people of Israel could not atone for their sin on their own. They needed the temple for atonement. Atonement was a task of the priests on behalf of the people, along with the whole temple apparatus with its sacrificial system. It was a physical and spatial reminder to them of how difficult it is to come before God in a state of sin. Everything had to be done perfectly within it, precisely the way it was spelt out in the law handed to Moses. Everything had to be spotlessly clean from the inside out, to the apparatus such as the bowls and the utensils, to the garments and even the undergarments that the priests wore. Nothing unclean was allowed within the temple. God has always wanted to bless and dwell with his people for his glory, and it's impossible for something defiled to come into the presence of a most holy God. And that's why Israel needed the temple. Now that they've started to rebuild the temple, it seems they're on track. But they're still defiled because we learn from other books written at the same time in the Bible that they again turn away from God. The declaration in Haggai 2:19 of blessing is not a reward for good behaviour, but an expression of the purposes of God. Their ultimate hope does not seem to lie in the physical temple. We learned from Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, that Israel was apathetic and temple worship was corrupt. Even in the new temple, God's people turn away from him. Malachi 3:1 says the hope lay in a future descendant of Israel's King David. Likewise, in the last section of Haggai 2:20-23, the focus moves away from the temple. In fact, the temple's not even mentioned. Haggai addresses Zerubbabel, who is the appointed governor of Judah. He's not the official king, but he is a descendant of David. It's a similar moment to Samuel 2:7, where King David is keen to build the first temple, but God tells him no, that's not to be his job. Instead, and probably more importantly, Israel will be blessed through David's descendants. Likewise, in Haggai, God keeps his promises. He's faithful to his people, and he tells Zerubbabel that the promises to bless is linked to the future, where God's chosen servant reigns over the earth. All other powers are swept away. Ultimately, this is fulfilled in Jesus, who's a descendant of David. The hope that Christians have in Jesus is a personal invitation available to everyone. The management of the plants that I walk into realise that underneath my personal protective equipment, I'm filthy, and they don't care, and they're not interested in me personally, only that I can solve their problem, and there it ends. It's the reverse with God. He is personally interested in me. He actually wants to do something about my defilement. And it's not because I can do anything for him. He is completely independent. He's the master engineer and creator of the universe, and we are his creatures. God does not need me, yet he wants a relationship with me. He wants to fix me. And it's not just me he wants to fix, it's everybody. He wants to fix all mankind. And he wants mankind to turn to him so he can bless us all. We see in the Gospels where Jesus encounters ordinary people. In Mark's Gospel, there are 13 instances where Jesus meets people and attends to their most personal need. And one of these is a man with leprosy. In Mark 1:40-45, when the leper personally encounters Jesus, Jesus heals him. Jesus touches him and he doesn't become defiled. Instead, the man is healed and becomes clean. In the Gospels, we see what the Old Testament prophets like Haggai are pointing to fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus effectively replaces the temple. Matthew 12:6 reads, "I tell you that one greater than the temple is here." And those are Jesus' words. No longer are the sacrificial system, the priests, and the temple apparatus required. Our relationship with Jesus is now personal. We can pray to God directly. Jesus has taken the punishment for the sin of mankind upon himself. Jesus had to die so that he could be resurrected and conquer death. And he promises that we will also be resurrected if we have faith and put our trust in him and ask him for forgiveness. Because of Jesus alone, we are made clean. We are not defiled, we are forgiven and washed clean in the eyes of God. We live for the day when Jesus returns. That is a day in the future. The day Haggai points to when he talks of God's promised blessing to Zerubbabel. It'll come through hard times like we're experiencing now, with turmoil and the destruction of nations, God's eternal kingdom will remain, where Jesus will rule over his people forever. That is our ultimate blessing, and that's what we long for.
I think we're all a bit too familiar with what God is saying here in Haggai 2, having to keep our distance. We no longer do we shake hands, we don't hug. I've lived in a mask at work and here for the last 3 or 4 months because there may be a chance of us being contaminated by COVID, and if we don't do these things. But sin is worse than COVID. In fact, it's spread right across the world and we're all contaminated. So let's praise God that he did not give up on us, but instead blessed us through his Son Jesus, who is able to cleanse all who believe in him. Jesus is the ultimate stain remover, and he will return one day and cleanse everything. Thanks for being here.